Module 2, Subaltern Studies and Introduction. This module will help us understand the meaning of the concept subaltern and the origin of the perspective, and then the emergence of subaltern studies in sociology in India. In the thousands years of history writing, it is clearly seen that there existed two kinds of people, superiors and inferiors in society. The superiors have been given more importance. Therefore, it is expected in subaltern studies to write the history again, making it free. The inclusion of lower people or common man's history has been agreed. This trend of writing consists of the agony of exploited workers, labourers, oppressed castes and women's income beyond the world of thoughts. The consciousness and autonomy of lower class regarding consciousness is the foundation of subaltern studies. In the work of subaltern studies, it is necessary to reach up to not only the ideological part, but also the livelihood of common people, that is, poor farmers, shepherds, workers, labourers, oppressed caste women. They are also human beings, they also think, take decisions, decide the way to live and grow in society. Subaltern studies, therefore, defies those historians who regard people's action as external to their consciousness. So, the chief concern of the subaltern studies venture is to appreciate the people's consciousness and their action. A proper analysis of this consciousness and its due recognition by the historians would rightly present and project the subalterns as the maker of the history they live out. In post-colonial studies and in critical theory, the term subaltern designates and identifies the colonial populations who are socially, politically and geographically excluded from the hierarchy of power of an imperial colony and from the metropolitan homeland of an empire. Antonio Gramsci coined the term subaltern to identify the cultural hegemony that excludes and displaces specific people and social groups from the socio-economic institutions of society in order to deny their agency and voices in colonial politics. The term subaltern and subaltern studies entered the vocabulary of post-colonial studies through the works of the subaltern studies group of historians who explored the political actor role of the men and women who constitute the mass population rather than re-explore the political actor roles of the social and economic elites in the history of India. As a method of investigation and analysis of the political role of subaltern populations, Karl Marx's theory of history presents colonial history from the perspective of the proletariat, that the who and the what of social class are determined by the economic relations among the social classes of a society. Since the 1970s, the term subaltern denoted the colonized people of the Indian subcontinent, imperial history told from below, from the perspective of the colonized people rather than from the perspective of the colonizers from Western Europe. By the 1980s, the subaltern studies method of historical inquiry was applied to South Asian historiography. As a method of intellectual discourse, the concept of the subaltern originated as a Eurocentric method of historical inquiry for the study of non-Western peoples of Africa, Asia and the Middle East and their relation to Western Europe as the center of world history. Subaltern studies became the model for historical research of the subaltern's experience of colonialism in the Indian subcontinent. Key concepts. Dipesh Chakrabarty states that the declared aim of subaltern studies was to produce historical analysis in which the subaltern groups were viewed as the subjects of history rather than the objects of it. The subaltern class was not homogeneous nor was it an object that history happened to, but a living group of people comprised of active participants in society. Ranajit Guha, in what is considered a hallmark work of subaltern studies, Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India, pluralizes the discourse of power by refusing to conflate capital and modernity in the extant histories. Capital and power can be considered as separate variables in understanding systems of subordination. In colonial India, in a way that European Marxist scholars like the Cambridge School of Historiography, including John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson, did not theorize as separate. Subjecthood is a large concern with the subaltern studies group's analysis of colonial society. Dipesh Chakrabarty discusses how the initial configurations of the subject in subaltern studies worked from an understanding of subjecthood as driven by social justice and political rebellion. The human in our anti-colonial mode of thinking was a figure of sovereignty. We wanted to make the peasant or the subaltern the subject of his or her history, period. And we thought of this subject in the image of the autonomous, rights-bearing person with the same access to representation in national and other histories as others from more privileged backgrounds enjoyed, taken from post-colonial studies and the challenge of climate change. However, Chakrabarty states that Spivak's involvement led the group to think of the discursive figure of the subject as an unstable category and invited them to write deconstructive histories of subjecthood. Another crucial tenet of subaltern studies at the conception was the rejection of a theological understanding of progress. European historians, usually those of the History from Below movement, writing on India, often referenced the peasant consciousness as that of pre-political, feudal or pre-modern, suggesting that it could progress into political consciousness. Guha and the rest of the initiative rejected such evolutionary formulations of political consciousness. Instead of considering the peasant consciousness as a backward anachronism in the face of the modern political world, subaltern studies argues that the peasant was contemporaneous with colonialism and had equal and important participation in the political realm. Dipesh Chakrabarty, in retrospect, later saw the two main sub-themes of subaltern studies as the archaic in the modern and the subject of history. Subaltern studies in retrospect and reminiscence. Tracing the systems of silencing and oppression is another key aspect of the subaltern studies intervention. The interrogation of systems in what Gayatri Chakravarty Spivak calls worlding, where a colonial or imperial narrative separates the colonized as third world, fetishes the third world as exotic, and thus legitimizes colonial domination, is a primary concern of subaltern studies work, especially in how these systems of worlding appear in the historical archive and narrative. In this vein, rather than focusing on highly visible displays of political consciousness like documented riots or uprising, subaltern studies seeks to discover the discourses of dissent and resistance arising from everyday political action. Since archival documents necessarily privilege the elite and the ruling class and completely occlude the illiterate, interrogations of such systemic and documented imbalance are crucial to a fuller understanding of the subaltern. Subaltern perspective in Indian sociology. In sociology, there are many factors like sex, caste, creed, race or any institution in which subordination is needed. A subaltern in a layman language is nothing but subordination. In subordination, it is not necessary that people will always coordinate. Sometimes there will be bold resistance to anything, and other times people can be convinced under superior forces. Hence, subaltern perspective goes with these two factors simultaneously. Ernesto Lacau in 1979, also called as post-Marxist, who worked in several sectors like the possibility of wars, capitalism effects, etc., also researched that political parties' debate targeted at masses does not indicate that this ideology simply means the conflict between two groups of people. Instead, he mentioned that subaltern perspective is observing the micro details of a human being, like his fight of himself with the society, his fight against others' ideology and behavior, to understand the concept of unity in an indifferent situation. Finding a calm scenario where conflicts were all set to ruin harmony was a tough challenge to sociology. This perspective challenges notions of sociology at a different level. The harmony part is tested in these situations. The people who are associated with education and research work strongly added that every subgroup determines changes and its effects in a society. But the people who are not mostly academic can also face some of the situations in which they can bring an abundant amount of change in society. Social existence and social forces are interlinked with each other. They are continuously a part of the discussion among scholars who keep on reading and analyzing to come up with the ideologies that can have an impact on society. More than submissive part of subordination, defiance part has more affected history. As the subaltern perspective also shows the characteristics of defiance, a popular movement study case is necessary to get a detailed view. Tribal peasant view was the movement which showed massive resistance to the British government for their rights. It was one of the massive opposition of two groups which proved to the world that not only elite class people's dominance or rules can be right all the time. The peasant people demanded their shares, and by a popular way, they also reclaimed history in a unique way. There were many revolts which took place at the late 80s. People witnessed defiance in such a way that evolution of new ideologies took place. The revolts' names were the Indigo Revolt, Pabna Movement, the Deccan's Peasants Uprising, Punjab Peasant Discontent, Champaran Satyagraha, the Kaira Satyagraha, Mopia Rebellion, and the Bordoli Satyagraha. The Indigo Movement of Bengal is quite a popular revolt because it was the first revolt witnessed between peasants and high rank officials. They first were forced to cultivate indigo at money much lesser than the actual price. Later, people began to revolt, and this revolt gained popularity in Bengal, forcing to abolish some of the taxes in 1869. One more popular movement was the Champaran Satyagraha. In Bihar, Champaran district farmers were obliged to grow indigo on 3/20 of their land. These forceful laws made people rebellious, and Gandhi reached Champaran as soon as he heard this news. Although high-ranked officials asked him to leave the place and tried to suppress their voice, he was also adamant on his decision, and finally in June 1917, a committee for the inquiry was held, including Gandhi, and at the end, the rule was successfully abolished. There are many examples in which peasants were strong and showed a sense of bold resistance and had their rights back. Thus, this perspective rewards them with the title makers of their own history. They fought with a sense of righteous consciousness for their rights in those times when our country was not even independent. B.R. Ambedkar and Kapil Kumar are well-known names in the sector of the subaltern perspective of Indian sociology. These subalterns somehow managed to show that how illogical and weak elite people can go to only follow the set pattern, not using their own judgment ability. They can be called as the eye-opener of Indian sociology because they took a stance for their rights. They got rebellious when it was most needed instead of sitting idle and following rules. When Dr. Ambedkar faced indifferent behavior since his childhood, he was curious to know why this kind of discrimination happens with them. For this, he conquered education from a different country and challenged the set notion of our country which boycotts SC bar STs in temples or wells. He was also a popular subaltern of his time. The literal meaning of subaltern is belonging to an inferior rank or position. Sociologists study and view the Indian society from various perspectives. Subaltern perspective is one of them. The subaltern perspective can be depicted through the caste, race, occupation, class, age, color and many more factors. It usually means subordination in any field and it embodies dominance and submissive behaviors. Subaltern studies. The primary leader was Ranajit Guha, who had written works on peasant uprisings in India. Another leading scholar of subaltern studies is Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. She draws on a number of theoretical positions in her analysis of Indian history: deconstruction, Marxism, feminism. She was highly critical of the current histories of India that were told from the vantage point of the colonizers, and she presented a story of the colony via the British administrators. What she and other historians, including Ranajit Guha, wanted was to reclaim their history, to give voice to the subjected peoples. Any other history merely reconstructs the imperialist hegemony and does not give voice to the people, those who resisted, those who supported, those who experienced colonial incursion. According to the Subaltern Studies group, this history is designed to be a contribution made by people on their own, that is, independently of the elite. In other words, proponents of subaltern studies suggest that we need to find alternate sources to locate the voice of the subaltern historically. Elite records could still be used, but you had to read them with a different pair of lenses. So, even though we might be subject to using these same sources, we can read them against the grain. This phrase comes from Walter Benjamin's theoretical work. Obviously, the introduction of subaltern studies, like all of our theories we've encountered this term, has tremendous political repercussions. In a society like Great Britain that claims to operate as a commonwealth, yet sees racism around every corner, as well as the desire to keep out the blacks who cause all the problems, the writing and mapping of a history of previously silent groups creates an undercurrent throughout society. Thus, subaltern history will help to lay bare previously covered histories, previously ignored events, previously purposeful hidden secrets of the past. All of these people dealt head-on with the concept of the other. Otherness is part of the modern nationalist rhetoric to define a nation, to have a nationalist spirit. Patriotism, for example, is to suggest a certain level of inclusion. If there is inclusion, a nation of the self, then how do you define it? The most obvious idea is to think in terms of binary oppositions of self bar other. So, the other was constructed as outside the nation. When this kind of bipolarity is established, the opposite tends to be negated. Otherness, once negated, is subject to the power of the colonizer. It is this discourse that early post-colonial thinkers like Said hoped to displace. Like scholars of gender, Said argued that the bipolar reduced race to an essentialist category, the voice of the subaltern. In Geographies of Post-Colonialism, Joanne Sharp developed Spivak's line of reasoning that Western intellectuals displaced to the margin of intellectual discourse the non-Western forms of knowing by reformulating and thus intellectually diminishing such forms of acquiring knowledge as myth and folklore. To be heard and to be known, the subaltern native must adopt Western ways of knowing, language, thought, reasoning. Because of such westernization, a subaltern people can never express their native ways of knowing and instead must conform their native expression of knowledge to the Western, colonial way of knowing the world. The subordinated native can be heard by the colonizers only by speaking the language of their empire. Thus, intellectual and cultural filters of conformity muddle the true voice of the subaltern native. For example, in colonial Latin America, the subordinate natives conformed to the colonial culture and used the linguistic filters of religion and servitude when addressing the Spanish imperial rulers. To make effective appeals to the Spanish crown, slaves and natives would address the rulers in ways that masked their own native ways of speaking. The historian Fernando Coronel said that his goal as an investigator must be to listen to the subaltern subjects and to interpret what I hear and to engage them and interact with their voices. We cannot ascend to a position of dominance over the voice, subjugating its words to the meanings we desire to attribute to them. That is simply another form of discrimination. The power to narrate somebody's story is a heavy task, and we must be conscious and aware of the complications involved. Like Spivak, Bellihooks questions the academic's engagement with the non-Western order, that in order to truly communicate with the subaltern native, the academic would have to remove him or herself as the expert at the center of the us and them binary social relation. Traditionally, the academic wants to learn of the subaltern native's experiences of colonialism, but does not want to know the subaltern's own explanation of his or her experiences of colonial domination. In light of the mechanics of Western knowledge, Hooke said that a true explanation can come only from the expertise of the Western academic. Thus, the subaltern native surrenders knowledge of colonialism to the investigating academic as a means of constructing a great history of society. The history of the subaltern native is a revealing examination of the experience of colonialism from the perspective of the subaltern man and the subaltern woman, the most powerless people living within the socio-economic confines of imperialism. Therefore, the academic investigator of post-colonialism must not assume cultural superiority when studying the voices of the subaltern natives. Development discourse. Mainstream development discourse, which is based upon knowledge of colonialism, concentrates upon modernization theory, wherein the modernization of an underdeveloped country should follow the path to modernization taken and established by the developed countries of the West. As such, modernization is characterized by free trade, open markets, capitalist economic systems, and democratic systems of governance as the means by which a nation should modernize their country en route to becoming a developed country in the Western style. Therefore, mainstream development discourse concentrates upon the application of universal social and political, economic and cultural policies that would nationally establish such modernization. In Making of a Development Geography, Victoria Lawson presents a critique of mainstream development discourse as a mere recreation of the subaltern, which is effected by means of the subaltern being disengaged from other social scales such as the locale and the community, not considering regional, social class and gender class, ethnic group, sexual differences among the peoples and countries being modernized. The continuation of the socio-cultural treatment of the subaltern as a subject of development, as a subordinate who is ignorant of what to do and how to do it, and by excluding the voices of the subject, peoples from the formulation of policy and practice used to effect the modernization. As such, the subaltern are peoples who have been silenced in the administration of the colonial states they constitute. They can be heard by means of their political actions effected in protest against the discourse of mainstream development, and thereby create their own proper forms of modernization and development. Hence, do subaltern social groups create social, political and cultural movements that contest exclusive claims to power of the Western imperialist powers, and so establish the use and application of local knowledge to create new spaces of opposition and alternative non-imperialist futures. Thank you.